let's talk about SPUR. Let's talk about perhaps a forgotten cohort in regard to how SPUR has operated, or to be more accurate, failed to operate effectively, and that is for victims of crime. I have a constituent, a couple, in fact, who for more than 10 years have been trying to have court-ordered restitution paid to them. It was handed to SPUR and they still haven't received that payment. However, when you go to the government and ask for their help, what they come back with is they say, no, there's confidentiality, we're not allowed to pass on the details of how these matters have been pursued by SPUR. So those who are the victims of crime, not only do they fail to receive restitution, they fail to get an explanation. I have raised this with a number of treasurers. I've also raised this issue with the current treasurer. And when I wrote to him more than 6 months ago, I raised
on a point
this
of
very
order,
fact.
Deputy Speaker.
Please take a seat, Member for Richard. Treasurer, what's your point of order?
Although an interesting story and a matter from
what's your point of order against standing orders, Treasurer?
It has nothing to do with this bill. It is entirely irrelevant.
So your point of order is on relevance?
Of course it is.
Okay, well, take a seat, please.
Thank you.
I would ask you to be mindful of the long title of the bill, Amendment for
Oh, absolutely, Mr Speaker. It's interesting to hear the Treasurer argue. This has got nothing to do with it. Got nothing to do with victims of crime who have court-ordered restitution payments held up in SPUR, in this case for more than 10 years. I would have thought that when you look at the explanatory notes under this Treasurer, who I wrote to more than 6 months ago and from whom I have yet failed to have a response. My office has not only, after writing to the Minister more than 6 months ago on behalf of the constituents who have not had payment from SPUR for court-ordered restitution, my office has also advised me that they've followed up with up to 4 bring-ups going back to the Treasurer's office, asking him what can he do to help. Well, we've just heard the Minister or the Treasurer get up and say, no, this bill's got nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with the victims of crime who are still waiting for court-ordered restitution. I'm really disappointed, Ms. Treasurer. I'm going to table that letter. I thought you could have at least, Minister, Treasurer, you could have at least replied to this response on behalf of constituents who are victims of crime, raising this issue, which is a fault in the SPUR system. I thought, well, let's look at the explanatory notes and the explanation about this bill. It says that there are aspects to deal with confidentiality to enable SPUR to interact with the courts and supposedly to make it easier to enable the information to flow so that they can gather the information required to get orders enacted. But when I've raised this about what about the victims of crime at the other end of the process, will they have the ability to find out what's happened and why they're still being held up? Well, according to the Treasurer today, no, this isn't relevant. I'm really disappointed, Treasurer. These are people, these are constituents, whether they live in my electorate or in the Treasurer's electorate. They deserve to have an answer from the Treasurer, not wait for 6 months and get nothing, and then get told that the confidentiality provisions and this SPUR amendment bill does nothing to resolve those issues. Very, very poor. Very, very poor. And I would expect there'll be other stories of victims of crime who found that they not only failed to get paid from court-ordered SPUR mechanisms, but they can't even get information. Very disappointed, Treasurer, that the Treasurer not only fails to care to respond to correspondence, tries to get up in this House and say it's got nothing to do with this bill.
On a point of
well,
order,
it's about time they looked after the victims of crime.
Member please take a seat.
The words that I do not care about constituents or victims of crime are personally offensive. I asked her to withdraw. And secondly, on a matter
I'll deal on that. We'll deal with the first one. Thank you. Take a seat,
Speaker.
Treasurer. Member for Maroochydore, the Treasurer. Thank you for withdrawal. I'll hear the second point of order.
Relevance. The member for Maroochydore has had a good go.
I refer to the explanatory notes that talk about.
Please take a seat, Member for Maroochydore. I believe that there is a reasonable link between the restitution for offenders and the penalty enforcement registry. I'll give you a bit of latitude there, but I encourage you to be mindful of the long title of the bill, Member for Maroochydore.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And as we see in the explanatory notes on page 6, it talks about disclosure of personal information in court orders. And it's a reasonable question to ask the Treasurer, what about the victims of crime? What about their right to information? And why this minister doesn't want to answer that question. And after 6 months of a very basic letter asking for his help, zip, radio silence, other than to try and abuse me. Okay, now that's disappointing, because there will be others whose stories are replicated, who find that they're not able to get the information about why they don't get their court-ordered restitution. Let's talk about another aspect of this State Penalties Enforcement Modernisation Amendment Bill, which also, interestingly enough, covers the RTA and all those rental bonds that are held by the RTA, the Residential Tenancy Authority. There are amendments in this legislation before the House that amend the Residential Tenancies and Rooming Accommodation Act 2008. Currently, when tenants' bonds are lodged with the RTA, they hold that on behalf of those tenants, so that the money is there secure to be paid back to them, presuming they meet the criteria of repayment. And for some reason, this government's cooked up a story where they want to take about $1 billion of people's rental bond and put it into consolidated revenue. Well, I don't think they've ever seen a hollow log they didn't want to whack their sticky fingers into, rip out. Now, we've heard the Treasurer say, oh, well, trust us, it's held, we will guarantee that those bonds will be paid back, but they don't explain what happens to the revenue that comes from $1 billion worth of rental bonds that have been lodged now or will be lodged into consolidated revenue. And they're a little bit cute about that, because that money then won't be going back to the RTA necessarily. It's in consolidated revenue. So after they've paid for the operations of the RTA, any surplus that's there from that $1 billion investment, from the proceeds, the revenue from that $1 billion investment, the government pockets it into consolidated revenue to go wherever they may see fit. And I think the criticisms that have been raised about why they've done this are valid criticisms. We've heard from agencies who said they weren't consulted about this before it happened. And now we hear government members trying to say, oh, but this is really to protect it. It's about security. $1 billion worth of rental bonds that were lodged with the RTA, there has been no skerrick of belief that that was ever under threat, that there was ever an issue where that money wasn't being appropriately invested, because it was being invested, as I understand, through the normal procedures that would get a return. And yet this government's trying to say, no, it was risky. Well, let's call out the garbage that this is. It's just an opportunity to take that money, put it in the consolidated revenue and benefit from the income that comes from $1 billion of investment, which belongs to renters around Queensland. I don't trust this dodgy government. I don't trust them when they go away from a self-funded model, put it into consolidated revenue and say it's for everybody else's own good. There needs to be transparency as to where the income from those bond dollars are going to be spent. And once they go into consolidated revenue, there is very little evidence that this government will abide by transparency in that regard. They haven't done it in the lead-up with a consultation over taking rental bond dollars, $1 billion worth, I understand, and I certainly don't trust that they're going to do it into the future. I have tabled that letter from earlier in regard to my constituents. Did I table that? Yeah. In regard to my constituents and the SPUR issue, I call on this Treasurer, please listen to the victims of crime in regard to SPUR, have some respect for them. I know this Treasurer likes to have his political spray against his opponents. Have some consideration of the victims of crime who need their questions answered, rather than being told that this legislation has nothing to do with them. What a shame, and what a shame it is that they aren't being heard by this Treasurer.